Well, good morning again, everyone, and welcome again to Crossroads. I'm Reed Robinette, and if we haven't met, I hope you already feel welcome this morning. Before we launch into the teaching, I wanted to just stop and give you some information, maybe sort of like a family report as we enter the last month of the year. As I think about 2018 and Crossroads and all of the different ways that we've seen God at work, there have been so many great moments. Many of you have been a part of them. And as I think about all of the things that we've gotten to experience, it creates a sense of thankfulness as we enter the last month of the year. And the thing that all of those moments have in common is this life change, that we've gotten to experience God's power to transform a life in all kinds of ways. All of our campuses and all of our missions affiliates, we've gotten to see a whole lot of life change. And numerically, it turns out that going into this last month of the year, our average attendance has increased about 20% over this time last year. Actually, 19.5 if you want to be technical about it. And I love drawing graphs, so I'm going to draw a graph of that. So if this bar indicates last year's attendance, and this bar indicates this year's attendance. Do you know what this is? That's a celebration. It's a celebration of the way that God has increased the impact of His kingdom in and through our church. And we should be so thankful that we got to be a part of that. Now, when it comes to the financial and resources side of things, our giving to date through 11 months is up just over 10% over last year. So not quite as much as the attendance, and that makes some sense, right? So if our giving went up by 10%, we know that when folks come, sometimes they're just checking out church, and we're glad that you're here. And we don't expect people to start giving right away. So we want to celebrate this increase as well, that God has allowed us to grow our generosity by about 10% over last year. Now, the last thing I want to tell you is that our expenses have grown by 13% over last year. So that graph looks like this. And so, do you know what this is? That's a gap. And in real dollars, we have collected, you have generously given about $1.8 million so far this year. What? That's incredible. And we're so thankful for that. If you had told me that 10 years ago, I would have not believed you. So thank you. And our expenses have been about $2.1 million. And so that represents that gap in real dollars of about $300,000 heading into the last month of the year. And you know what? I think we can close that gap. And I think we can do it this way. If everybody participates and God leads. Now, when it comes to giving, I understand that we're all in different places. For some of you, you've never given a gift to Crossroads yet, and this might be a wonderful time for you to start and participate. Others of you give off and on. This would be a time we'd ask you to be on. That if you would think of giving a year-end gift, that would be super. Many of you are consistently giving. Maybe this for you would be an opportunity to give an extra gift in addition to your consistent giving. And still others of you are sacrificial givers. And you have decided that what God is doing in and through our body here is important enough to do whatever it takes. And so maybe God's asking you to be a part of making up this gap as well. But here's what I want to encourage you to do. Let your heart go first. And so let's talk to God first about it. If everybody here did these two things, number one, pray. I mean, no, seriously. Would you, for the next month, pray that God would provide for us? He can do miracles. And sometimes all His word says that we don't have because we just don't ask. Would you ask? Would you join me in asking for God's provision? So pray and then listen. Would you, before you decide what role you're going to play, would you listen to how God prompts your heart? And then make it personal. What role does God want you to play in us finishing the year in great shape? I'm going to leave that between you and God, and I'm going to trust that God's going to continue to provide as he always has. So now back to our regularly scheduled programming. We began, as you've already heard, this series that leads up to Christmas last week. And in it, we are looking at Christmas from a little bit of a different perspective. We've looked at the preparations that God was making before and leading into the actual arrival of Jesus. And it turns out that God was preparing for hundreds and hundreds of years and actually giving clues about the coming of Jesus. He did that many times through the prophets, people who simply spoke for God. And so all leading up to Christmas this year, we're using one of those prophecies, the prophet Isaiah, writing 700 years before the birth of Jesus, who foretold what this event would mean. From God's perspective, God was giving clarity as to what this event would mean when it finally happened. And so, if you weren't with us last week, I'll read the passage to you again from Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. And this is what it says. It says, "For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace." Now, all of those names say something about the nature of who God is, represented by the birth of Jesus, right? And I said last week, which one of those don't you need more of? Wise counsel? No, I got that all figured out. Strength in your life? No, I always have enough strength to avoid temptation, not give in to urges. No, I don't need any more strength. Yeah. Do you need the security of an everlasting Father? Do you need the peace that comes when everything is as it is supposed to be? Nothing broken, nothing missing. Of course, there's not one of those things that I would say, I don't need any of that. And yet that's the promise of what Jesus brings in his birth. And so each one can make a very present and a very practical difference in our lives. And so last week we focused all about Wonderful Counselor, and I won't go back and review all of it, but we just said that Jesus, because of his authority, meaning his power and his expertise, along with his compassion and understanding, makes him this wonder counselor. This counsel that's available that we can go to. And the way that we have to go, if you remember, was we have to be honest, we have to listen, and we have to do what he says. If you missed that, go back and grab last week's message online. This week, we're launching into and want to understand the second name that Isaiah gives to Jesus 700 years ahead of time, which is Mighty God. Now, if you think for a second with me, that's an odd name to give an expectant child. In other words, if I said to someone who's expecting here in the room this morning, "Oh, I heard you guys were expecting. Have you thought about names for your child?" And you said, "Oh yeah, as a matter of fact, we have. We're going to name him 5-star General." I would think you're a little odd. I would think that doesn't make any. If I said, "Oh, it's going to be a girl. Have you guys thought of girls' names?" And you said, "Yes, her name's going to be CEO of Amazon." I would just think, that's odd. And yet, 700 years ahead of the birth of Jesus, God says his name is going to be Mighty God. Little baby, Mighty God. And I'm going to tell you this morning that if we could get our arms around what that means, it can change your perspective on virtually everything in your life. The way that you view life can be altered because of the way we understand what this name means. Now, if we would understand it correctly, this name could provide joy and confidence and peace and contentment as we live our lives in any circumstance. But if we misunderstand mighty God in what it means, it will cause us anxiety and anger and confusion and maybe even despair. So it's that important that we would understand what this name means, mighty God. And so in order to do that, I want to read you a psalm. The Psalms are a collection of poems and songs in the Old Testament written about the nature of God, who God is, and how he interacts with people. And in Psalm 91, we read about this might that God has, about the power of God. And it paints a picture of what mighty God looks like. So let me read it to you. I'm going to read you the whole psalm. Psalm 91. Listen. It says, "Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, He is my refuge, my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare, from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and your rampart. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only observe with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked. If you say, 'The Lord is my refuge,' and you make the Most High your dwelling, no harm will overtake you, no disaster will come to your tent. For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the cobra and will trample the great lion and the serpent. Because He loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He will call on me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him with honor. With long life, I will satisfy him and show him my salvation." This is God's word. And this claim is one that we must understand. Here's the claim, that you can trust God, and if you trust God, He will protect you. And it's not just given in a general way, this claim. We are given first images of how God will protect us. It says He's a shelter and a shade. It says His shadow. That would be the shade. You know how great shade feels when you're just out on a hot day and the sun is beating down? He's a shelter and a shade, a refuge, a fortress. It calls God a shield and a rampart. You know what a rampart is? There's big scaffolds that they build to block the enemy's attack, to keep the enemy out. All of these are images of the effects of the power of God in our lives. There's another one. Did you see it says, He will cover us with the feathers of His wing. I love this analogy because it's the picture of a mother bird protecting her young. And so, you could take the imagery that I read to begin with of the rampart and the shield and all that and think very masculine, very, macho God. But then it says, and also like with this tenderness and with this intimacy, and it combines those two images that says, God is this kind of protection for you. And then it doesn't stop there, but the claim continues and is actually described. So it says, because God is that, if you trust God, He will protect you. Well, like what? And then it makes these bold claims. It says things like, no violence will happen to you. No harm will come to you. No sickness, that's the pestilence, that word I sort of stumbled over a couple times. No sickness will be a part of your life. No disasters will happen to you. All of these are descriptions of how God's protection will show up in your life. And it goes so far as to say, did you see it in verse 12? It says, you won't even stub your toe. You won't even stub your foot on a rock if God is protecting you. And in verse 14, it sort of summarizes it. I'll read it again. And it says this, because he loves me, says the Lord, I'll rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He trusts in me, some versions say. So there it is. Jesus, mighty God, he will protect you if you trust in God. Now, can I tell you? There are two ways to completely misunderstand this claim. And it's so common. It's so common when I begin to describe it to you, you'll say, oh, yeah, I recognize that feeling. And if we don't correctly understand, remember, here's what it's going to leave us with. Anger, anxiety, confusion. If you misunderstand this claim of the mighty God who protects you as you trust in him. Let me give you the two misunderstandings, and then we'll talk about how to really understand this truth. Now, first misunderstanding goes this way. So if you trust God, you will never experience any of those things, sickness and harm and violence and struggle. And so, therefore, if you experience any of those things, all right, hold on, let me just stop and make sure I understand the room this morning. Raise your hand if you've never experienced any of those things before. I'll give you a minute. I can't actually see who's raising their hands, but I'm going to take a wild leap in our Westminster campus. I'm going to take a wild leap in our Eldersburg campus and say, my guess is no. There's nobody raising their hand. Why? Because we've all experienced that stuff. Of course we have. That's what makes this misunderstanding so destructive. Because the theory then goes, if you trust in God, you won't experience any of that. And since we all have, we draw this conclusion, well, I must not trust God then. There must be something wrong with me or my faith. Because it seems to say, if I have this trust in God, I won't experience any of that. Now, I think this is very common and completely wrong. I mean, completely wrong. In fact, there's a book in the Old Testament. It's called the book of Job. It's some scholars think it's the oldest actually written down book of the Old Testament. And it's about a guy whose name was Job, and he had all sorts of really terrible stuff happen to him. And his three best friends came to him, well-meaning, God-fearing friends. And they said to him just what I just said to you. They misunderstood what the power and the protection of God would mean. And they looked at poor Job and they said, wow, you must have really messed up. Look at your life. It's falling apart. That must mean that you have betrayed God in some way. And here's what I want you to hear. God is quoted as responding to these three. And in Job 42:7, he says this, you have not spoken truth about me. That is not correct. I love the way Job responds to them. In one place, he says to them, to his friends, if only you would be altogether silent. For you, this would be wisdom. And that's what you need to say to some of us this morning. The voices that are saying, my circumstances are a sign that I've not trusted God, that he's punishing me in some way. He's allowing these bad things to happen. That's a misunderstanding of the claim of the power and the protection of God. Now, secondly, that's the first way we can misunderstand and get all messed up. But the second way is maybe the opposite side of the same coin. It's the idea that God promises that if you trust him, he'll protect you and you won't experience any suffering. And so therefore, if you experience any sort of suffering or pain, and again, anybody avoid that in their entire life? No, of course not. So this misunderstanding concludes, you can't trust God then. God promises this claim. We just read it. That if you trust me, I'll protect you. So if God doesn't protect me in the way that I imagined it, that must make God untrustworthy. And you know who says that? It's not a well-meaning friend, actually. It's actually the enemy of God. Did you know that the one verse in all the Bible that Satan is recorded as quoting is Psalm 91? You might remember this. It's in Luke chapter 4 when Jesus is being tempted in the desert, and there's Satan. And the third temptation is, he quotes this scripture. And he says, well, go ahead and jump. Because doesn't it say that God will protect you and not let you stub your foot even? The enemy of God knows how destructive it is for us to misunderstand this verse. He quotes it. Do you want me to tell you what happens when you jump off of a building? You fall. Not because God is not faithful, but because of the laws of gravity. And that might seem overly simplistic, but it does get at the reason and the way that we misinterpret this promise, this claim, that if you trust in God, he will protect you. So that's not it. If you believe that mighty God means that because of God's power, you are promised a life with no suffering or pain, you will either be, one, anxious and fearful. So whenever something bad happens, you're like, oh, I must have messed up somehow. Or you will be angry and lose confidence in God. Why? Because you go, look, you promised and you didn't fulfill. Both of those are things that I see people deal with all the time in their faith journey, based on a misunderstanding of this promise. So, if we can read this psalm in its context, and this is a big if we can take the stream of truth, the thread of truth that's pulled all the way through the scriptures and apply it to our understanding of this claim, oh, it will produce joy and confidence and freedom. And then to do that, you know I've said this before, that means that the scriptures, the Bible is not a group of stories all talking about how you can find God. They're actually one storyline about how God finds us. And so, although our style here is to take one passage, like today's Psalm 91, and we just try to mine it for all it's worth, sometimes we have to read in the context of the greater truth that's revealed in order to correctly understand the one passage that we're reading. And so that's what I want to do with the time that we have left this morning. I want to give you three verses, three passages that give us clues. We'll circle around this truth until we can really apply it correctly to our lives. Genesis 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Now, in order to understand the context here, you have to understand this is about Joseph, and I don't have time to go into all the Joseph story. In fact, we're going to do that in January. But Joseph has had this incredibly up and down roller coaster of a life, where he was sold into slavery by his brothers, but because of his giftedness and his ingenuity, he became a trusted confidant of the king. But then the king's wife accused him of sleeping with her because she wanted to, but he didn't want to. It's a whole other story. And he ends up back in prison again, and only to find himself back at the king's side to make decisions before a famine comes to the whole land, where he ends up saving a whole bunch of food that ends up saving a whole bunch of people's lives. That's the backstory of this verse that says his brothers came to him and they were worried. And Joseph says, look, I know you were intending to harm me, but God took that and he intended it for good. Now, let me ask you something. As we try to circle around, how does this relate to the power and the might of God? Did God cause the evil choices and the evil things to happen? That would be an emphatic no. No, he did not. Those were choices made by people that were contrary, were the opposite of the heart of God. Were they really not bad things if you look at it in a different way? Like, they might seem bad, but if you look at it a different, like every cloud has a silver lining. Emphatically, no. No, they were bad things. Bad things are bad things. Injustice and oppression are always opposite of the heart of God. So the first thing we have to get clear on is, as we circle in on what does this mean, it doesn't mean pretend like everything's okay. Pretend like bad things don't exist. That's not the point. All things are not good, but the point is God's power is not in contradiction to that saying. All things are good, and God still is at work. All right, let me give you the next verse. The next verse is Romans 8:28, really often quoted verse from the New Testament. The Apostle Paul is writing, and he writes these somewhat familiar words. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So let me ask you again. Does this say that all things are good things? No, emphatically no. We just learned that. They're not all good things. But God allows not good things to happen. Why? I'm not going to be able to answer that question sufficiently for anybody in the room. And maybe that's helpful. If someone pretends like they can explain that completely to you, I would be very skeptical. But here's what I know. I know that the reason must be God's love for us. Because this scripture says that in all things, good things and bad things, God continually works for the good. That he's motivated by his love for us in everything that he does. God is motivated by his love for us. So somehow, the things that are allowed that aren't good are a part of the loving plan of God. He can even use the bad choices, the evil intentions of people. All things are not good. God allows evil things that cause him and us pain, all because of his love. Okay, now one more passage, and this one might be the most obscure one, but it's the most close to the bullseye of us understanding how to apply this mighty God name to our lives. It's the words of Jesus. It's in Luke chapter 21, where he's telling people things are going to get bad, which, right, if you would just read that part, would say, oh, so he's not promising nothing bad will happen? No, in fact, he says it's going to get really bad. I'll pick it up in verse 16. Jesus here speaking. He says, You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. That's bad. Everyone will hate you because of me. Wow, that sounds really bad. And then he says, but not a hair of your head will perish. Wait, what? Wait, didn't he just say, some of you are going to be put to death? Mm-hmm. And then he says, and not a hair on your head will perish. What, is he just going to save your hair? I mean, that can't be. There's not some sacredness about hair. The bald people in the room are like, okay, good. Here's what this means. It means that the part of you that lasts forever, God will not let anything harm. That there is a part of you, sometimes it's called your soul. Sometimes it's called your heart. Sometimes it's called your spirit. Whatever that is, and that's a whole nother teaching. But the part of you that lasts forever, God says, I won't let anything happen to that. That you are going to be able to confidently know, I will protect the part of you that lasts forever. And I will use the suffering and pain that you see in the world to help that to happen. That means this. If you love anything more than you love God, God's going to allow and use the forces around you and in this world, your circumstances, to prevent that from damaging the part of you that belongs to Him forever. That's why this last verse is so interesting, verse 19. In the NIV translation, it says, stand firm and you will win life. Stand firm is be patient. Endure. Endure what? Endure the suffering of your situations, the hardships of this life. One translation is in long suffering, you will win life. The other way to say that is gain yourself. Possess your soul is what the old King James Version says. And can you see this? As long as you love something else, anything else, more than you love God, you don't actually possess your soul. You don't own your soul. At least not all of it. It's owned by something else. It's only by yielding all of your soul to God that you receive it back complete, but not divided, and able to be that thing, that part of you that lasts forever. So you can be sure that the mighty God who arrived in Jesus will use His power to protect that part of you that will last forever. And it is all because of His love, and He will use all the painful realities in this world to get you to that point. That will give you a completely different perspective on living your life, on the way that you view your circumstances. Well, you say, how do you expect me to believe that? Christmas. Christmas is how I expect you to believe that. I'll read you one more verse from the Psalm 91. Go all the way back. Verse 15, God says, He will call on me and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. Did you see that? In trouble. Not in spite of, not removing the trouble. I will be with him in trouble. God, who was exempt from suffering and trouble, decides to step into it at Christmas, puts skin on, and enters our world. This is the mighty God on full display. You say, well, baby doesn't look very mighty, a little baby. Little baby, mighty God, and here's why. Who has more strength? The one who sees a bad situation and does nothing to remedy it because they don't want to get involved, or someone who sees a desperate situation and forgoes the risk, the cost to them, and enters in to fix it? You know the answer to that question. It's the one who enters. That's Christmas. And God, in our trouble with us, points forward not only to Christmas, but also to the cross, right? Because the birth happens because the cross is required. The incarnation is executed because the substitution is necessary. And so as we celebrate Christmas and we celebrate the mighty God, it's the idea that this mighty God came to you. And so now you can come to him. And that's what we're going to do here at the end of this service. I'm going to invite the worship team to come back up. And our response this morning is communion. And we are going to, in just a moment, have the ushers pass out the elements. I'm going to ask that you take both of them and hold them together because we're going to partake all at one time. And as we are passing out the elements and listening to this song, I want you to let your heart lead your head, okay? I want you to prepare your heart in this way. I want to invite you to focus on the display of God's might that is on display in the stable at Christmas. I want you to see how far he would go for you. And then I want you to imagine if he would go that far for you, why wouldn't you receive what he went all that way to give you? And that's what we do when we receive communion together. We are saying together, I want what you came all that way to give me. Let's